Greetings to everybody and welcome to the 5th episode of NatureSpeaks. NatureSpeaks is brought to you by Himalayan Nature, and I'm Him, working for GSL in Kathmandu, Nepal office. For today's program, I'm supported by Dr. Tulsi Subedi, Director of Himalayan Nature and co-host of NatureSpeaks. Keeping up with our great tradition of having renowned scholars, this time we have invited an internationally renowned personality who has contributed enormously towards saving wetland birds around the globe. Today's guest speaker is no other than Dr. Taej Mundkur. Before our guest greets you, let me give you a brief introduction about his work. Taej has a doctorate in waterbird ecology, and early on, now for 30 years, that he is working for the Wetlands International. He started his career working in Malaysia. At that time, it was known as Asian Wetland Bureau in 1990. And he was responsible for regional coordination of the Asian Waterbird Census and a range of other flyway projects. From 1996 to 2006, he led the development of Asia Pacific Migratory Waterbird Conservation Strategy and advised the development of the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership, which was launched in 2006. He was based briefly in India during those years when he led the development of a CMS action plan for migratory waterbirds and wetlands in the Central Asian Flyway, and that was launched by the government of India in 2006. So for the past 11 years, Taej is based in the Netherlands, working as a senior technical officer for this great institution known as the Wetlands International. He is responsible for development and strengthening of the various flyway conservation programs while he works there. He also coordinates the Global International Waterbird Census. And as you know, some of you who are here today, you have been taking part in the Midwinter Waterbird Count or the Asian Waterbirds Census that started in Nepal in 1987. He has worked for FAO when avian flu was identified as threats not only to businesses, but also to human health. His role there was to ensure that wild birds should not be blamed and persecuted just in the name of avian flu, because it has other reasons also. He has worked for CMS in various capacity and currently serves as the chair of the Global Convention on Migratory Species, CMS Flyways Working Group. Although his work is largely focused on waterbirds and wetlands, he is generally interested on wildlife, awareness, raising research, conservation, wildlife and environment in general. And for his publication, I suggest you to refer to Himalayan Nature Post, and that gives quite a detail about it. So let's welcome Dr. Taej Mundkur. Taej, welcome.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here, and many thanks to you, Haim and Tulsi, for inviting me to participate in this presentation.
Thank you, Taej. I will just have one more announcement. After that, I will give the floor to you for your presentation. I just wanted to let everybody know that this session is being recorded and live streamed via Facebook. And regarding the presentation, if you'd like to ask any questions to Dr. Taej, please do so through the chat options available just before the presentation is finished. And I will read them for Taej to answer. And I will try to pick up most questions. So now let's hear the presentation. Over to you, Taej.
Thank you very much. Let me go into the presentation mode. Okay. Oopsie daisy. Let's start at the beginning. Okay. Just to check, can you all see the first slide?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thanks, Tulsi. Well, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, depending on which part of the world you're in for this presentation. It is a great pleasure for me to speak to you all. I'm speaking from our home in Arnhem in the Netherlands. And so it's quite outside the Central Asian flyway that you're looking at, but my heart remains firmly within the Central Asian flyway. I thank Haim for the very detailed introduction. And yes, indeed, it's been a pleasure working with him for the last 3 decades, as well as many of you who are on this call. I started my career, as was mentioned, in Malaysia, which is really in the middle of the East Asian Australasian flyway. And having done a lot of work there for 14 years, I moved to India, where I helped to develop the Central Asian Flyway Action Plan. And then for the last decade and more have been in the Netherlands looking at our global waterbird work. And the reason I mention this is because waterbirds are a way to connect people. And because they migrate, they offer the opportunity for international cooperation, bilateral cooperation, not just for waterbirds, but also for wetland conservation, for awareness raising, for policy development. And I hope that this presentation provides you some understanding of how can we use waterbirds as a tool for conservation, as well as to protect many waterbirds that, if you are reading the news, you'll know that many species of waterbirds, particularly migratory waterbirds, are declining, and we need to do much more to conserve them, which often means conserving their habitats. So what are waterbirds? Well, my presentation will take us through a brief explanation of what waterbirds are, what are wetlands, what are flyways. I focus on the Central Asian flyway, and I talk a little about the conservation frameworks at the end. So in Asia, we are fortunate that we have a wide variety of waterbird species, and waterbirds are basically those birds that are dependent on wetlands or water through their annual cycle. Either they depend on water throughout the year, or for a part of the year, they may nest in or near wetlands or on water. They depend on water and wetlands for food. And during their migration, they often depend on wetlands to stop on, to rest, feed, molt, and continue their migration. So this is one set of images. I won't go into the details of these different species, but you can see that there's a wide variety of species with different shaped beaks, different lengths of legs, different lengths of necks. And this wide variety of characteristics means that species can use different kinds of wetlands in many different ways. And the food that they feed on varies considerably, from tiny microscopic organisms living in the water to large fish or even other waterbird species. Now, waterbirds depend on wetlands, and I spent a few moments talking to you about what wetlands are, because this is a word which is not necessarily translated well into different national languages and has many different connotations depending on which part of the world you are in, or whether you're familiar with different wetlands inland or coastal wetlands. So if we start up in the mountains, glaciers, frozen water, are the form of wetland because they are ice, and as they melt, they become water, and then they flow down through high altitude streams, down through the fast flowing streams and rivers up in the Himalaya, for example, down into the middle course, and then right down to the seashores. And through this long journey, these wetlands are of many different types. You may have a fast flowing stream, you may have a narrow gully, you may have a large freshwater swamp. Many of these wetlands have been transformed for human use. So you've got rice fields, irrigation schemes, lakes, man-made lakes or reservoirs. And some of these, as the stars indicate, these are wetlands that are considered as man-made or artificial. So wetlands include both natural and man-made or artificial wetlands. On the coast, you have a range of wetlands types. So you may have coral reefs, you may have seagrass beds, mudflats, intertidal mudflats, which are extremely important for waterbirds. You may have large mangrove forests. Unfortunately, many of these are being destroyed for the construction of various projects, including cities, towns, ports, and other artificial wetlands such as aquaculture ponds or saltworks. So there are a wide range of wetlands, and waterbirds tend to use nearly all these types except for glaciers perhaps. And if we look at what the definition of wetlands are, because every country often has a different definition, countries have come together under the Convention on Wetlands, or the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, and they have a very standard definition which has been prescribed by the convention. So I'm not going into the details of this, but it's sufficient to say that basically wetlands cover any area of land on which there is water, either on a temporary basis or a permanent basis. That water may be flowing or it may be static, like in a pond. It may be fresh or brackish or salty, and it includes areas of coastal water up to the depth of 6 meters at low tide. So that is the cutoff for the wetland definition in the ocean or on the coast. But being pragmatic, if one needs to manage wetlands, then if a wetland such as a lake is more than is deep, then you need to manage the whole lake, not just the shallow part of the lake, because you've got to manage it as an entire unit, a functional unit. So you will need to manage areas that are deeper than 6 meters at low tide in the coastal areas. And this is an important thing to remember, because people who are using the convention need to understand how to best manage wetlands as ecological units in order to ensure that they are functionally active and can be maintained in the long term. And last but not least, the convention, as I mentioned earlier, looks at both natural and semi-natural or artificial wetlands. And the convention lists sites of international importance that governments propose under what is called the Ramsar list of wetlands, which now covers more than 2,500 sites around the world. And Nepal and most countries in the world are now contracting parties to this convention, and many of them are taking important actions for conservation actions. So this is very good. More and more countries are learning to use the convention for the benefit of people, for the benefit of nature and wetlands. And it's a matter of looking at sustainable development and conservation at the same time. I draw your attention to the document listed below called the Strategic Framework and Guidelines, which if you Google it, you will find it contains a lot of interesting information on how the convention can help you at a national level or international level for conservation. Well, waterbirds depend on these wetlands, and it's good to understand how these birds use these wetlands on an annual cycle that many birds migrate from the north. So for the months of, say, May to July, birds are right across the Arctic, the northern parts. Some of these stars show you where important areas could be. These birds are breeding here. These birds include ducks, geese, swans, shorebirds, and some gulls and terns. After they finish breeding, the birds start migrating south during the months of about August to October. They use many different areas, both coastal wetlands and inland wetlands. Some of them undertake amazing, spectacular migrations non-stop from Alaska down to New Zealand, a distance of 11,000 kilometers non-stop. And I'll talk a little bit about this amazing bird, the Bartle Godwit, later. So when they've reached their destination for that year during the months of November to February, they are fairly stable in one area, or they may move around locally. And this is the non-breeding period, or the northern winter, as people in the north would say. Then during March, April, May, as the weather warms up in the tropics, you will find that birds are migrating north, back to their breeding grounds. And they use the same or other sites, because some of these wetlands go through seasonal changes themselves. So some of the wetlands may not exist in March or April, or there may not be food there for them. So the birds need to use other wetlands. And so, as you can now see, through an annual cycle, there's a large number of stars showing up on this map. And this is only an indicative map to show you that there are wetlands everywhere. And birds depend on this large network of sites, what we can call an ecological network. And the connectivity of these networks is extremely important to be maintained if we want to protect and maintain and even restore many of these declining waterbirds. So this is about the annual migration cycle. And if we look at the world, to help us manage the world and connect people and connect birds, we use the definition of flyways and divide the world into different flyways depending on the species you're dealing with. And so for waterbirds, recognizing that many of these birds breed up in the Arctic, so the Arctic connects the world through 9 major flyways. But what does a flyway actually mean? Well, to help us, there is a standard definition which I'd like to show you. A flyway is basically the entire range of a migratory species or a group of related species or distinct populations of single species through which it moves on an annual basis from the breeding grounds to the non-breeding areas through intermediate resting areas, feeding areas, as well as the area within which the birds migrate. So it's quite a simple and a broad definition of what is a flyway. So it depends on what you're interested in, whether you apply it at a species level or a group of species, such as you can talk about a duck or a group of different species of ducks, or you can talk about all waterbirds, and the definition of flyway could be applied at any level. The information comes from a paper written by Gerard Boer and David Stroud, and it's there for you. Well, so if we've understood what the definition of flyways is, let's look at that in practice. Here is the star, one of the many species that show us how the world is really connected from the Arctic, well, almost to the ends of the earth. The Bartle Godwit has been marked using satellite transmitters, and I'll show you a satellite transmitter in another slide. They've been marked in Australia, in Northwest Australia, in New Zealand, in Bahr al-Hikman, in Oman, in Guinea-Bissau and Senegal in West Africa. And you can see that during this migration period, during the months of March, April, as the birds flew north, different birds flew to different areas. One group of birds flew to Iceland, where they are now nesting. Another group of birds flew all the way through Northwest Europe, including the Netherlands and the Wadden Sea, which is an amazing internationally important wetland, all the way up to the north here, where we expect that they would be nesting. Interestingly enough, you will see, you will see that birds from here down in Oman have met up with some of the birds here. One of these birds from West Africa has gone all the way east of the Taimyr Peninsula, so it's gone really far to the east. The birds from Australia have gone to far eastern Russia, whereas the birds from New Zealand have flown non-stop to the Yellow Sea, which is between China and Korea, meeting up with the birds from Australia there, but then undertaking another amazing flight non-stop direct to the coast of Alaska. In the next months, we expect that these birds will be starting to fly south. They may use the same route or different routes, as I mentioned earlier. And what we know from previous studies is that the Bartle Godwit will fly directly from Alaska or the Aleutian Islands down here, non-stop directly to New Zealand. 11,000 kilometers in 5 to 7 days, flying and at an altitude of 5,000 to 7,000 meters. So that is an amazing feat to think that they are flying across the vast Pacific Ocean. Hawaii is about here. You've got all the other Pacific islands here, but they fly non-stop directly and end up exhausted in North New Zealand. And when they land there, they are hungry, they are thirsty, and they're very tired. So they need a safe place to stop and rest and feed and put on weight again. And then come March, April or March, they're migrating non-stop again here. So this species completes its annual life cycle in basically 3 jumps, which is just amazing, covering about 25,000 kilometers on an annual trip. So that's the world expert, the Bartle Godwit. Other species do it in different ways. Each have their own strategy for survival. Let's look at something else. The little species in the hand here is the ring plover, which nests across the top from Europe to Far Eastern Russia. And birds that were caught there with this little transmitter, this is called a geolocator, weighing between 1 to 2 grams. These birds were tracked flying across Russia down here to West Asia and even Africa, and then flying all the way back on same or different routes. For example, you can see that the green track comes here and then goes back this way. So on one route, it follows one way and then it returns on another route. So this little bird undertakes this spectacular migration, flying over Nepal and South Asia. A few ring plovers also come down to South Asia as well. But we don't know where they come from, because this is the first study really that's been looking at tracking of these birds. Moving on, if we focus now on the Central Asian flyway, which is a grouping of about 30 countries in the region of this green polygon, or this line, from the Arctic breeding grounds in Russia, all the way down to the Maldives Islands and the British Indian Ocean territory right at the south. That is the length of the Central Asian flyway. So you can see most of it is on the ground. It's a land-bound flyway. Our understanding of the migration in this flyway has come in the Central Asian flyway, really started with the amazing species, the Barheaded Goose. Now this bird was first color marked in Bharatpur in India, and it undertook a short migration through Nepal to southern Tibet, where it nested. Thereafter, and Haim mentioned at the start of the presentation that avian influenza and study of avian influenza has helped us to understand how birds migrate and their impact on the disease. A lot of interest was turned into action because of avian influenza to support migration research. And tens of thousands of barheaded geese were neck collared with color marks to study their migration. In addition, many of them were marked with satellite transmitters. And this satellite transmitter work, as well as the color marking, has revealed a very interesting situation with the barheaded geese. The barheaded geese breed here in Kyrgyzstan, they breed in Mongolia, and they breed in Qinghai Lake in China. They breed across here in Ladakh, as well as in the lower Tibetan Plateau region as well. What we've learned is that the birds that breed furthermost north tend to migrate furthermost south. And this is called leapfrog migration. Whereas the birds which breed in more middle latitudes undertake shorter distance migrations. This is never the full picture because there are other birds doing other things. And so far the studies have focused on these areas, and therefore they've revealed the migrations through the eastern Himalayas, and have shown us that this area of Bhutan and eastern Nepal and the area of Sikkim sandwiched between Nepal and Bhutan are an extremely important corridor or a flyway, a bottleneck for these migratory species, for this migratory species. And you'll see the same with the others, which I'll talk about in a minute. Some early studies from the lakes in southern Kyrgyzstan showed that the birds migrated to Pakistan as well as to the lakes in Kashmir, and then migrated first east to eastern Tibet and then, western Tibet, and then back to their breeding grounds. So each of them following slightly different migration patterns. The source of the information is down at the bottom. So if you are interested, please do look at this book, Bird Migration Across the Himalayas. It has a wealth of information, and many of the images I use here are from this publication, which came out in 2017. The next star is the demoiselle crane. This species breeds in Mongolia, in Kazakhstan, in southern Russia, and China, particularly in Mongolia. And these birds migrate in South Asia across the Tibetan plateau, directly over the Himalayas and down to India. Other birds breeding further west in Kazakhstan have been shown to come through the Hindu Kush mountains, through the high peaks, across into Pakistan. Many of them stay in Pakistan. Others go back through another route, but still the number of routes that they have here are quite limited because of the high mountain passes. The birds have to find the gaps and travel through these. So this is the demoiselle crane, a very beautiful species seen in large numbers on migration in the Himalayas. And I think there's been some wonderful video and other films showing how these birds migrate through Nepal, stop when the weather is bad, get ready to fly just as the weather is improving. And on that migration, many of them are even attacked by the eagles up in the mountains and are eaten there. So they form an important food source for other birds. Looking at ducks. Here we are looking at various species that have been tracked. And this map is what we call a heat map, which shows where the marked individuals have spent more time. The darker red is where they've spent more time. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the area between Nepal and Bhutan and Sikkim, this area is a major flyway for many ducks. This is also where the Himalayas are a little less high compared to the Western Himalaya. And you'll see a little more about that later. And through other studies on the east, to the west, you can see another route going all the way down to the south of India. This does not mean that birds don't travel on other routes. This just means that the birds that have been studied, these are the routes that they have taken. Birds travel across many parts of the region, stopping at many different areas. So here we can see the arganey teal or the arganey with this yellow arrow pointing to, I'm just trying to minimize this. Yes, this yellow arrow pointing to the satellite transmitter. This is amazing technology, and over the years, the size of these transmitters have reduced, the weight has reduced, and as a result, these transmitters can safely be used on smaller size species, such as this arganey teal. This female, her name is Kiswa. She was marked by a team in Bangladesh. And this bird traveled along this yellow path to presumably its breeding grounds in northern China, up in the hills. and after finishing its migration, it came back to Bangladesh. So it's completed its migration. Here you can see that it crosses the Himalayas on both its routes, and it's presumably stopped at some places to rest, such as this lake and maybe others. And this shows you the precise migration of this species. This was publicized in a newspaper, and it's good to see that the local national news media are now very keen to promote information such as this. Now we take a slightly different look at the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau, and these different colors indicate the height. So you've got peaks which are greater than 6,000 meters with these white plus signs. You've got the plains of the Indian subcontinent and the low foothills in yellow. And you can see a steep rise from here, if you look at the scale, from brown to purple and pink, indicating that this is the main barrier of the Himalaya Hindu Kush region. So for birds to fly across, they need to be able to go right up over these mountains and come down to the plains. And here you can see the tracks of barheaded geese as they migrate and jump over the Himalayas and then spread out in India. If you were to follow the route of this white line from this point where the birds are marked down to the south here, this white line is the straight line distance, the shortest distance between these 2 points. But if you look at the tracks, you will see that all the tracks are further east of this direct line, which means that the birds are not using the shortest distance from here to here, but they are modifying their route in order to take advantage of safe flight paths where they can stop and rest. And here you can see to the east of this white plus sign, most of the tracks are here, which means that these birds are choosing to fly at a slightly lower altitude than the highest peaks. So this is the take-home message from this slide. And different species, again, will use it in different ways. So if we were to look at the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush from the south, so from India, you can see areas marked in red are those areas which are over 5,000 meters. And we know that some species would prefer not to travel through this area. They would rather go around. Whereas some other species like cranes and the demoiselle crane, which I showed you earlier, will fly through the gaps, and they can fly up to 5,500 meters or so. Whereas for the geese or the passerines, which are the perching birds, they can fly over 6,000 meters and more. So different birds using different routes. One of the species that's special to the Himalaya and the Tibetan Plateau is the black-necked crane, which, as I learned yesterday from him, does come to the westernmost part of Nepal, and would be interesting for people to study and follow the situation there for these species, because it is a very limited distribution species, choosing high altitude areas from Ladakh in northwestern India to the main Tibetan Plateau. And here you can see this beautiful bird nesting in the mountains in China. Now these birds, waterbirds, are also eaten by other species. And here we talk about the king of the migrant predators, that's the peregrine falcon, which breeds right up in the top in the Arctic. And these birds have been tracked from here all the way down to Pakistan on the coast here, in central India, down to the coast of Bangladesh, and down to Thailand. And you can see that different birds have followed different routes. And through this heat map again, you can see that they've stopped at certain places, including on a route in Nepal, in southern Nepal. And this you can see even more clearly in this image. It's just a zooming in of the same image. So this, these predators, these peregrine falcons, are also known as duck hawks because they eat large numbers of duck and other birds, including shorebirds. So where the peregrine goes, he will go where the food is available, including these ducks. I want to switch gear because we thought we knew the Central Asian flyway as being from the north in the Arctic down to the subcontinent in India. But new research in the last 2 years with the Oriental pratincoal has shown something completely different. A species that we thought was a local migrant or migrant within the subcontinent was marked down in Broome in Northwest Australia. And 4 birds were marked. One of them went to Taiwan, another 2 stopped in Cambodia, and 1 zipped across to Odisha and then went to Karnataka, where it stopped and it nested. And Dr. Subramania went there and he found the bird. Here you can see it has a yellow tag. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a very fine transmitter aerial here. He found the bird, he found it nesting, and then thereafter the bird flew south to Sri Lanka. And from Sri Lanka, it flew non-stop from Sri Lanka to Sumatra and then back to Broome. Not necessarily to the Broome town, but in that area. Having spent the northern winter there, it then flew back and is back in Karnataka. So it shows us that this is the normal breeding, normal migration route for this species that connects the subcontinent to Australia. Excuse me. So if we look at conservation frameworks that exist around the world, and these are the 3 main conservation flyways, if we say. At the global level, we've got the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, the CMS Convention on Migratory Species, CITES, which deals with the trade in endangered species, and CAF, which is dealing with the Arctic flora and fauna. And as we've seen, the Arctic connects us to all flyways. I won't spend any time talking about this. I'm sure you can find more details yourself on the internet. It's just suffice to say that these conventions and many of these conventions are signed up to by most countries, and I believe Nepal is doing very well on this front and implementing many of these conventions as well. If we look at flyways, if we start in the Americas, where many of the oldest flyway agreements started, but particularly in North America, but then extending to South America, there are various frameworks dealing with different species. In Europe, the Berne Convention, Natura 2000, which is a very powerful mechanism for governments to take action for conservation of species and habitats, as well as the overriding African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement, provides a framework for more than 105 countries from the breeding grounds in Russia and all the way to Eastern Canada down to South Africa. Then we've got the Central Asian Flyway, about which I've spoken about and for which there is an action plan under CMS. And the East Asian Australasian Flyway has what's called a partnership approach, which is working quite well, which was launched more than a decade ago. So there are different frameworks for different flyways. If we stick with the Central Asian Flyway, as I mentioned, it is largely a landlocked flyway until you reach the, Sri Lanka and Maldives and the British Indian Ocean Territory islands. Because we are dealing with the Arctic, we are dealing with the plains of Central Asia, we are dealing with South Asia down to the coast and the Himalayas. Obviously, this area encompasses many different ecological conditions, and as I've shown you, many of the species breeding up in the north on the Arctic coast are migrating south, down to South Asia. It has a large number of species here listed, more than 279 waterbird species of 279 populations of 182 species. What is useful to note is that many populations and species are globally threatened, and within this flyway there are a couple of species of special interest, such as the Indian skimmer, the Ibis Bill, as well as the black-necked crane that I just showed you. Here are some images of the species that are critically endangered. And down at the bottom is this famous spoonbill sandpiper. Up here is the Siberian crane, which unfortunately no longer comes to South Asia, and there's only one bird coming to Iran. The whole population now only migrates to China, and there are about between 3,500 and 4,500 birds. So still relatively safe, but also under great threat because of the habitat being lost there. Down here is the sociable plover, which does come down to India, and the bald ibis, which is in the western part of the flyway in West Asia. I've talked about problems. Well, if we look at wetlands, one of the big problems is worldwide wetlands are going down. Here is a graph which shows you how it's declining across the world from Africa to Asia. So nowhere is it safe. And yet governments, through all their various international commitments, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, the Aichi biodiversity targets of 2020, the Paris Agreement on climate change, and the land degradation neutrality call, all talk about the importance and the essential need to manage wetlands, and that they need to be healthy and functioning. But the reality is different on the ground, and therefore much more needs to be done to protect these. Talking about conservation at the international level and using the Central Asian Flyway as an example, I would like to just mention that over the last 20 years, we have been working with governments in the region, organizing various events, meetings, conferences to raise awareness, bring people together, talk about problems and challenges for conservation. This is an image from 2005 in India, in Delhi, where people from 23 countries came together to develop an action plan. We've launched a network, and I'll talk about this in a moment. There's been a couple of other meetings, and most recently in February in India was the 13th meeting of the Conference of Parties of the CMS, or the Bonn Convention as some people know it as, where the Prime Minister of India, in his opening speech, talked about the importance of conserving birds along the Central Asian Flyway. So we hope that with greater interest from the political sphere, from right at the top at the Prime Minister level, that 20 years of development in getting people to come together will now start bearing fruit in terms of real action. And some of the actions needed include conservation of sites, because unless we can protect wetlands, we cannot protect migratory birds. This means there's a need to strengthen protected area networks at the national level and connect them by choosing the most important sites that the birds breed at or stop on during their migration or during the non-breeding area, so that indeed we have a functional ecological network about which I mentioned earlier. Conserving species and habitats means we need to talk to others, and that means making sure that our priorities for waterbird conservation and wetland management feed into national and local human development plans and programs, because unless people are happy, healthy, and fed, they are not going to pay attention to species other than humans. So we need to make sure that these plans are better integrated. I've shown you some amazing results of research. Yes, there's some good research happening, but there are many, many, many questions which remain unanswered. So we need to have more research being done to tell us what's going on and how birds are changing their migrations with the changing climate and with the loss of many wetlands. We've been talking around this issue of monitoring, and I'll spend a few seconds after this slide to talk about monitoring of waterbirds and wetlands that provides us up-to-date knowledge about species. There is a huge problem of illegal killing of waterbirds across the flyway, even in countries where it is not allowed to do so by law, and we need to ensure and encourage that there is greater law enforcement to eliminate this illegal harvest of birds. This means we need to raise awareness of people, of the general public, of the various sectors, and importantly, the decision makers, about the amazing beauty and value of waterbirds and wetlands. When you love something, you want to do something about it. You can only love something when you know something about it. So raising awareness is very important. And because we are dealing with migratory species, strengthening international cooperation, sharing experience, expertise, and using frameworks for conservation is a top priority in this flyway. And there's lots to learn from other flyways. I mentioned briefly about the network which was established. This was established in 2007 through great leadership work of the International Crane Foundation, working with the CMS and others, including Wetlands International. And what we did was we helped set up a network of sites focused on the Siberian crane from its breeding grounds in the north to the non-breeding grounds here near the town of Ramsar, as well as Bharatpur. But as I mentioned, we've lost this species on these two flyways. But this network of sites offers us the opportunity to expand it to cover other areas across the whole of the Central Asian flyway and include all internationally important sites for waterbirds and protect and better manage them. And bringing management together, the Indian government has shown the way in framing what they've called the National Action Plan for Conservation of Migratory Waterbirds and Their Habitats in the Central Asian Flyway for a 5-year period, which really helps to bring together not just actions for migratory waterbirds, but all migratory species, looking at habitats used by these different species, therefore dealing with habitat management and restoration, single species action plans, reaching out to various stakeholders at the national and local level, awareness raising priorities, capacity building, research, monitoring, policy development, and showing how protecting migratory birds and their habitats really helps the government deal with a range of national commitments and international goals and objectives. Raising awareness has been promoted through World Migratory Bird Day. This is a UN event organized jointly by the CMS, the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement, and Environment for the Americas. And each year there is a different theme. Last year's theme was on plastic pollution and how to solve that problem. Nepal, I understand, is actively involved in this, as are many other countries around the world. This is a wonderful event that helps to raise awareness at the local level through local events, and this can involve schools, colleges, villages, towns, cities, universities, and it happens twice a year. It's focused around the second Saturday of May and October, but it really offers the opportunity to organize events through the months of May and October. In 2020, very difficult year because of COVID-19 and the restrictions. Even so, many people around the world organized in very innovative ways different events, including online events, to demonstrate how birds connect our world. And we wait to see the results from this. If by October things are better, we hope that in Nepal you will be able to organize some events around this World Migratory Bird Day. In terms of monitoring of waterbirds, I've got a few slides here, after which I'll end the presentation. And here I'm just trying to show you that people from different walks of life in very different climates are involved in monitoring birds. From the mountains where it's frozen, people are wearing very thick gear to keep warm, down to the coast and rice fields where people are monitoring birds. This work happens on a volunteer basis in many places. People who are enthusiastic go out and count at different times of the year. But one monitoring program that we've been running since 1967 is called the International Waterbird Census. It's a global program. And in Asia, it started in 1987, and it's called the Asian Waterbird Census. Himalayan Nature is now the national coordinator for the AWC, as it's called in Nepal, and we have coordinators in each country who, on a volunteer basis, are organizing the census with their network locally. Most people participate in the census during January or February, and in some places it's happening in July, and about 45 million waterbirds are counted around the world at more than 17,000 sites. So it's a fairly large program. In fact, it's probably the longest running and the largest citizen science biodiversity monitoring program of the world. More information is available on the website, the link of which is here on this page. As I mentioned, it's a volunteer network, and here is an image of on the top, the national coordinators from the different countries in Asia. We met in Thailand a year or more ago, and lots of smiling faces of very enthusiastic people who are on a voluntary basis coordinating the census in their country. And in the bottom slide here, you can see a group of part of the 100+ people involved in counting birds in one wetland area in Kerala, in Vembanad Coal, and they've been doing this for the last 30 years. So it's amazing information coming out through such activities. This quickly shows you the network from the ground, the volunteers who are working through state coordinators in some countries, such as India, which is very large and requires many coordinators. They send information to the national coordinator, and they finally send us information at the flyway level, and we produce the flyway level summaries. But a lot of national level reports are also produced, and these are the logos of the coordinators at the national level, and here's Himalayan Nature in the middle. So these participants go out in January, count waterbirds, and in some countries they are happy to produce a certificate that encourages participation in each year. So this is an example from Odisha state in India. We've had very interesting reports produced by the state coordinators in some countries, national coordinators in others. And this is an example of how a report for Goa showed the numbers of birds counted in different wetlands in 2018, but importantly also showed over time, since the 1980s to 2018, how the numbers of ducks had been decreasing over time. And if you look at the numbers of individuals, you can see a drastic reduction from the 1990s to 2018. And this raised alarm bells and caused the local groups to get more involved, and the government and the forest department in conservation action. So turning information into practice is a good thing based on sound information. So this is what the census does. At the global level, we did an analysis which showed that in countries where waterbirds are monitored through various schemes, including the International Waterbird Census and the Christmas Island bird count in America, countries where there is good legislation and where the legislation is well enforced through protected area management, populations of waterbirds are improving. Whereas in countries where there is weaker legislation or implementation of legislation, then populations are not doing as well. We looked also not just at the waterbirds, but also at the wetlands. And in 2019, we started an assessment program of the wetlands where participants, besides counting the waterbirds, were also looking at what are the threats to wetlands and waterbirds. And you can see here that the main threats reported were pollution, as well as down at the bottom, encroachment, which meant reduction of the wetland and loss of the wetland. I won't go into the details here, but you can find all this information in the December newsletter of the Asian Waterbird Census on this website. But what we did find was that if we look at the first 50 responses, there was fishing at many of these wetlands. There was disturbance during the counts at many of the wetlands. And although hunting of waterbirds is illegal, it was reported at about 1/4 of these wetlands. What was really surprising was the number of sites for which there seems to be disturbance by domestic dogs, and many people are reporting and photographing how domestic dogs are scaring birds or even killing them. Here's a dog with a little grebe in its mouth. This information is being turned into awareness raising material, and a lot of good publicity is in the press nationally and internationally. Here's an example, and where you have counts happening at the same site in over different years, you can show the public how numbers of birds are changing. In this case, it's decreasing in 2020 in Okla in Delhi. There are lots of tools that you can use, so you don't have to start from zero. There's lots of interesting training material on wetlands, on guidance for ecotourism, on looking at the impact of power lines, which is becoming a big problem, and how to reduce the impact through using various techniques is shown in these technical guidelines. And looking at the birds themselves, the threatened species have single species action plans, and some of these are relevant, perhaps the spoonbill is relevant to Nepal as well, so it's worth looking at it. All these can be downloaded from the websites of these partners, the logos of which are here, all on the CMS or Iowa website. This is the latest action plan which has just come out, which is for the Dalmatian pelican, which is doing better in Europe and in East Asia. The birds that breed in Mongolia and migrate to China, well, there are less than 200 birds. So it's really a species and a population at high risk. So we hope that this action plan will help to galvanize action for the species. I'd like to end with a couple of slides, and this is the famous Ibis Bill, which is in Nepal, is in the Tibetan plateau, and comes down. So this species does not migrate long distances from north to south, but goes from the top of the hills and in the rivers down to the lowlands in the northern winter. And therefore they connect us from Nepal down to the south. And management of these wetlands therefore needs to look at a river basin approach from the mountains down to the sea. And this is what connects people from Nepal down to India and Bangladesh as one example, where wetlands are being used by people and birds and nature, and we have to find ways to live together. I'd end here with a publication that was produced by the CMS, which is a bird's eye view on flyways. It's a very user-friendly publication, so I encourage you to have a look at it. I'd like to end here by thanking the photographers who provided pictures for this presentation, and also to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, Taej, for that beautiful presentation. Very informative, full with knowledge. So without wasting time, I will start taking questions, if that's all right with you. So the first question is from Basu Bidari, who is the former president of Bird Education Society from Chitwan. What was the largest migration in history? The largest bird migration in history, I guess he means. And what problems do migrating birds face? I think the latter questions you have answered in your presentation. So what was the largest migration, bird migration in history? Maybe in terms of size, numbers.
Wow, that's a good question. I guess it depends on which species you're talking about and which time of in history, because things have changed, and as I mentioned, many species have declined. So the further you go back into history, then I guess there would have been even more impressive migrations than we've seen currently. But as an example, the migration of the passenger pigeon was supposed to be one where you had birds flying in a flock for hours. Now, for many birds to be flying, or birds to be flying, if you're standing in one place, to be flying for a few hours past you, that must be pretty amazing to have, well, millions of birds migrating or flying past you. So that would be quite a spectacular sight. But there are many places even now where you can see quite spectacular migrations, and these are usually places where birds congregate on migration, and some of these are called flyway bottlenecks along the west part of, well, maybe in the Himalayas there are places we don't know where the birds do migrate in large numbers, and they are quite spectacular. Many of them may fly even at night and therefore are not being seen. But Eilat in Israel is a well-known migration flyway site where you can see birds migrating over. In Thailand, there are places where you can see raptors, birds of prey, flying over in large numbers. In Malaysia, south of Kuala Lumpur, there is a lighthouse where if you stand, you see birds flying and migrating across, birds of prey migrating across to Sumatra. So it depends on where you are. You can see spectacular migrations of different types.
You'll have to make it short because there are other questions also. So
Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your answers. I think that has made Basu happy. I can see him smile. So we can there's another question from, just forgive me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, your name, Tanji Olivier Amosu. The question is, what are the roles of these waterbirds in the introduction of alien fish? And I think it's very interesting question. I did read a paper recently. So Taej, please be brief in answering because there are other questions also.
Well, that's a very interesting question and very timely question, because just a couple of weeks ago, we had a new paper which showed that species of cyprinids, fish, the eggs of the fish can be swallowed by ducks, and through our experimental research, they showed that the droppings of the fish, the droppings of the bird after the digestion of the eggs, those eggs can be hatched into young fish. It means that if a bird eats some fish eggs and flies a distance, it could then drop those eggs in its droppings at another wetland, and at that site those fish could survive or start their life. This means that birds could help transfer fish from one lake to another lake, including lakes in volcanoes, which have no other way of getting fish coming naturally into them. And this could help answer some of the very interesting questions about how did fish get into volcanic lakes and high altitude lakes.
Thank you, Taej. I think there is, as you said, there's a paper, and hopefully the person asking question can also get hold of that paper. The other question is another $1 million kind of question, Taej. So just, I think you'll have to be brief here. How is the information about flyways transferred to the offsprings, young ones? Is it a memory or genetically transferred information or something else? It's Amar Kumar from Department of Zoology here, Nepal.
Well, thank you for that question. It is a $1 million question. Different species use different ways of transmitting that information. The larger birds, such as geese, the young geese fly with their parents, or the storks, or the cranes. So the parents teach the young the migration during their first travel south. And because of that, the young birds learn where to stop and where to go. Other species, we know, the young will fly without their parents. and some of these birds are doing the long distance migration on their own, it clearly means that there is something in their genetic makeup that allows them to know where to go and where to stop. So it's a combination of different factors that allows birds to undertake these spectacular migrations. And we are still learning more and more about them. And every time you learn more, you realize you know less, and there are more puzzles to solve. But there's a lot of literature written about it. So again, I'd suggest that the internet and publications on bird migration will help you to answer these questions.
Thank you, Tej. Other question. So I'm receiving these questions through the options of the chat. Chat
Yes.
options available here. So just for some of you, if you are looking for the to ask questions to Tej. So another question is from Yus Rusila Noor. What is the take-home message of the latest info from Oriental Pratin Coal route in terms of inter-flyway collaboration? Maybe you can answer it in a couple of sentences, I think.
Sure.
Tej, please.
Well, this species, the Oriental Pratin Coal, has shown us that we cannot live in isolated boxes or flyways. We have to collaborate between flyways, because the birds, such as this species, forces us to do that. We cannot stick to our traditional flyways to conserve them. So we have to find different ways of collaborating and joint research activities. And as we learn of different routes, we have to find ways to conserve those important sites. There's a lot more that I could say, but maybe that's good for now.
Yeah, thank you, Tej. The other two people asking, Kamal Raj Gosai and Amrit Paudel, both are biologists here in Nepal. They're asking about, well, it's again, broad question, climate change effect on migratory birds. And, whether the COVID-19 had given some kind of respite to these birds. How are the human modification of wetlands and landscape in the flyway affecting the migration? So
okay,
I'll
talk about the first and the third point together: climate change and human impacts on wetlands. Well, what we know and what we learn is that, like all nature forms, birds want to survive. So they are trying their best to adapt to the changing climate conditions, as well as to the different habitat changes. What we find is that many species are suffering because, for example, I don't know if you heard, but the temperature in the Arctic just now is plus 10 degrees more than normal. This means basically that the frozen permafrost of the northern Arctic is thawing, which means that the land is turning into lakes or shallow water. That means the birds, where they would normally have nested and found food, the area is flooded. So we can expect that many birds did not breed successfully this year because the habitat for them in the Arctic is just not right. And if you have a few years of bad weather or high temperatures in the Arctic, it means that the breeding of these species is completely ruined. And that would mean the population declines for those species or that part of this population which breeds in areas. So very quickly, the Arctic is one example of how the climate is changing, but everywhere the climate is changing around the world. More floods, more droughts, coastal development, riverine development, high altitude wetland development, which basically means everywhere that the birds need to go to stop, feed, rest on their annual migration, they are being confronted by changes in the climate and loss of habitat. So the birds are trying their best, and we have to recognize that our actions are playing a huge role in the survival of species. And we have modified the habitats so much that we have to take the initiative and action to restore wetlands, to restore forests, to restore grasslands for these different species to be surviving. And their survival means our survival. So it's not just survival of birds for the sake of the birds, but it's survival of the birds for the sake of humanity as well.
Elena Yusti from Aceh, Sumatra. Question is, how do human activities affect migratory birds, and how does migration benefit birds and the environment? So birds migrate during the day. So I think it's...
Well, birds, because of their migration, as I showed, connect us from the Arctic to Indonesia. And these birds, through their annual migration, are feeding in different areas. They are transporting, as we heard, fish, for example, over some distances. But large numbers of birds are also feeding in an area when they are there, which means that the birds have the ability, through their feeding activities, through their resting activities, to change and modify, to modify the environment on an annual basis, which is part of the natural cycle. So if you have a large number of ducks or geese coming into an area of a wetland, and they are eating vegetation, both aquatic vegetation in the water and grasses around the wetland, it means that they will be feeding and removing those grasses. That means there is space for new grasses to grow. Similarly, if they are eating fish, they are eating certain species and certain sizes of fish, others not necessarily geese, but other species of ducks, or cormorants. That means the space, the wetland has space for new species to grow in numbers and in diversity. So the birds have a huge impact on maintaining the ecological balance for the other species.
Thank you, Tej. Nishanti Pereira. Is there a collaboration between Ramsar and CMS with the Central Asian Flyway? Should be a quick answer for you.
Sure. There is collaboration between all the environmental conventions, and the secretariats of the conventions are working together to strengthen that collaboration.
Devendra, do migration of a particular species is responsible for the sex role reversal within the pair?
Sex role reversal.
So it's not really clear. So do migration of a particular species is responsible for the sex role reversal within the pair? Can you see the question also on your screen?
I don't understand it enough.
We can skip this, I think. Next one I pick up from Sujan Chatterjee, our friend from West Bengal, I think. How does hunting in breeding grounds of the ducks affect the population? While some country has banned hunting, why do some country allow hunting of ducks? There's a kind of policy.
Very, very interesting question. And it comes
did you hear that?
Free flyway. Ducks and other birds up in the Arctic are often the only food that the local people, besides reindeer and fish, as sources of protein. So the people living up in the Arctic traditionally have depended on the seasonal migration of these birds to the Arctic to get their food sources. And the legislation in different countries has changed over time, although the traditional rights of the Arctic people, whether in Russia or Scandinavia or in Canada or Alaska, allows for some take of certain species, not threatened species, as well as they have hunting seasons when they allow the harvest or shooting of these birds and taking of their eggs in some cases. So this is what happens by law in these countries. In many countries, even though the law says you can't hunt, there are illegal activities, and this is where, without controls, you have greater problem and reduction in populations. If you want to conserve a migratory species, such as a duck, which is being legally hunted in one country, then all the countries in that flyway of that duck need to be able to talk together using an intergovernmental framework to agree that if there is hunting, it is done in a sustainable manner. And if there is a problem with that population, if the population declines, there must be a mechanism in that international cooperation framework to stop the hunting. Either you stop it for one season or multiple seasons until the population comes back again. And this is part of sustainable management of migratory birds.
Thank you, Tej. Another question is from Rudy Hidayat. I do not know if I fully understand the question. One of the potentials to know about migrating birds from China and Siberia that stopped briefly in Indragiri Hilir, Riau, before heading to Australia is the Asian blackoak bird. Blackoak bird. Asian blackoak bird. I never heard that. Perhaps you know this.
No, I have to say I'm not familiar with what the name of the species is, but yes, there are species of birds that do breed in the north, fly through China and go down to the Riau Peninsula in Indonesia, but I'm not sure of the species, so it's difficult to answer further on the question that may have been posed.
Another question that Tulsi picked up from Facebook, Himalayan Nature's Facebook, is from Krishan Kant Bakshi. I think that question on climate change effect and migration route of birds and wetland ecosystem, one, I think that you touched already more or less. Another question is, when the time of heavy rain and heavy storm, how birds change their route?
Well, that's an interesting question. And again, through satellite telemetry, we've seen some amazing images of tracks of birds. So if you have a bird migrating north and you have a storm coming from one side, the birds may try and move around it and sometimes get caught in the storm or in a typhoon, and you'll see them flying around it once. And then because they are tired, they sometimes go back to where they came from. We've seen that with curlew and with Bartle Godwit, I believe. So the birds are trying to survive. They may not always know when there are safe flights, and they will get caught in bad weather. And oftentimes, if there is sudden bad weather like heavy rain or thunderclouds, you'll find that the birds come down to stop on the ground in places where they don't normally rest on migration. So you may see one morning there are lots of birds around your house, and normally they are not there. Often it means that on their migration the weather was bad, and so they had to come down to the earth to rest until the weather improved, and then they will continue their migration.
Yeah, thank you. There are a few questions from Indonesia, but I'll pick up one of them for you. In Aceh, in March, we found Oriental pratincold breeding.
Yes.
While so far we know that Oriental pratincold breeding in Vietnam, is this a change in behavior when breeding in the feeding or roosting site area? I mean, has there been a change? Yeah.
Well, this is a species about which we are learning more, and I think it's also, let's say, it's a tribute to the people in Indonesia, the young bird watchers and researchers and photographers who are going out and looking more intensively in these areas and discovering new things. Whether those birds used to breed there in the past or they have started breeding there now is difficult to say, because there aren't a lot of records of these areas from the past. So perhaps the Oriental pratincold has always been breeding there, but people were not going there. If we know, and the people who've been going there say they've been going there for the last 20 years, but this is the first time they've seen it happening, then maybe there are some birds which are now stopping to breed there. And it's not surprising. We know that birds have a geographic range, but over time, you may have some birds at the edge of the range breeding further outwards in new areas, adapting to the changes in the climate. It may be that good rainfall or bad rainfall requires that the birds are moving slightly to different places to nest.
Thank you, Taej. That was the last question because we are running over the time, you know. So do you have anything to say to the audience? Just 1 minute for you.
Wow. Well, I really want to
1 minute
to thank you for the opportunity to speak. I really appreciate it, and I'm really happy to see that there are so many people from different parts of the region participating in this seminar or webinar, and I hope it's been useful for you all. There is so much information that we have, but every time I prepare for such a presentation, I realize that there's so much we don't know. And it really depends on all of you out there going out day after day, year after year, collecting information, sharing that information, publicizing that information, getting more people interested, aware of birds and wetlands and waterbirds, and taking local action for conservation. Getting local politicians, getting local government officials, getting the local industry, recognizing the importance of local wetlands. You don't talk only about conserving internationally important wetlands, because as I've shown you, we need a large ecological network of sites around the world to conserve birds. And through local action on the ground, you can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll just close the meeting on behalf of the organizers and audience. Thank you, Taej, for sharing your expertise, giving us time, waterbird conservation, all the policy advocacy work you have done, and the good work of the Wetlands International that you are affiliated with. Your presentation has been very informative, as I said, and there was a lot of message to take home. And also many thanks to the audience for joining us in this presentation and joining the Q&A session. And those of you who joined us a bit late, please be reminded that the entire presentation will be available on Himalayan Nature's YouTube site. So you can have a look, and also you can look at the citations that Taej has put just at the bottom of the slides if you wanted to get more information. So we'll be back with another presentation within a week. So please follow Himalayan Nature's page to find out what's coming next. But today I would like to wish everybody goodbye and namaste. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you.